There was a card that no one had thought to warn her about, and the handwriting on it was the Duke's own. Elspeth Morrow knew that hand at once, the small forward press of each capital, the crisp break between word and word, the way the M in Miss curled at the base, like something that had been drawn on purpose and then drawn again, quickly, as though he had not been satisfied the first time. She had received 3 notes in that hand across the previous 4 months, all pertaining to Lady Stratham's gown, all folded twice and sealed with the same plain grey wax, and all preserved between the pages of her ledger because she had, in her own quiet way, learned to save the letters of gentlemen whose accounts she wished to be certain would be honoured. The footman set the card down at the chair immediately to the right of the Duke of Ashford. He did it with the practised blankness of a servant who had placed 32 such cards along that table in the past hour and considered none of them worth the movement of his eyebrow. Miss E. Morrow, between the Viscountess Carell, and at the head of that long table, the Duke of Ashford himself. She had arrived to deliver a finished gown. She had not been invited to remain. 2 days earlier, in a green sitting room with the curtains drawn against a November afternoon, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford had told her, with the precision of a woman who expected to be required to say the thing only once in her life, "My son does not seat tradeswomen at his table. It is a rule of long standing." Elspeth had said, "Of course, Your Grace," and had gone on pinning the hem. The card said otherwise. November of 1813, Ashford Park, 3 miles north of Marlborough in Wiltshire, on the sort of low green hill that made visiting clergy write poetry and travelling solicitors write inflated estimates for the roof. The lake at the foot of the South Lawn had been dug in 1801, when the second Duke had decided the view wanted mending. The elm avenue had been planted in 1778 and had not, so far, disappointed. The house sat in the middle of these decisions, with the calm of a building that had been rebuilt 3 times and had learned to expect nothing worse than repair. Elspeth Morrow was 27 years old. She wore, that evening, the dress she had chosen without ceremony for the trip out from town, a plain wool of the colour the linen drapers called dove, cut clean at the throat, with cuffs turned twice to keep them from the wet of the coach step. Her hair was the brown of chestnut fallen a week. Her hands were small and clever, and at that particular moment very cold. There was a dog somewhere on the grounds barking at a bird. She had, in the corridor, taken off her outer glove and forgotten to put it back on. If you are listening from a room where the weather is louder than the fire tonight, tell me in the comments. The city, the hour, whatever kitchen or corridor you are in. I read every one. And if these stories of dukes and dressmakers make your breath go a little slower, leave the subscribe here beside you. It is my quiet way of knowing you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in Regency England. Its people and its houses are entirely imagined. Any resemblance to persons or events real is only coincidence. The order that had first brought Elspeth Morrow across the elms of Ashford Park had come in the ordinary way. Lady Stratham, the Duke's elder sister, then residing at the Dower House at Marlborough for a season of quiet. Her second son had been ill through the summer, and the physician had recommended air, had asked her housekeeper to send for the modiste, whom Lady Bramfield had used the previous winter. The housekeeper had sent for Miss Morrow. The commission had been for 2 gowns, one of pale primrose for morning, one of a green so dark it was nearly evening. Lady Stratham, 33 years of age, and the mother of 3 small boys, had received the modiste in a private sitting room and had, across the discussion of sleeves, mentioned that her husband disliked green. "Then we shall make it for the mornings when your husband is fishing," Elspeth had said, and Lady Stratham had laughed for the first time in what her housekeeper afterward said had been 3 weeks. The invoice for the gowns had been rendered on the 15th of August. It had not been paid on the 15th of September. Elspeth had, without fuss, sent a note. On the 22nd of September, a reply had arrived, not from Lady Stratham, and not from Viscount Stratham, but from Ashford Park itself, a single page, folded twice in a hand she did not yet know. My sister has been unwell. The account will be settled this week. Kindly regard the delay as no reflection upon your work, which she has praised at length. Ashford. He had signed with the title alone. The account had been settled 2 days later. The bank draft, of a size that suggested the Duke had not troubled himself to look at the underlying sum, had been drawn on Coots of the Strand and had crossed her small brass counter with the mild indifference of money that had never needed to justify itself. The second note had come in early October. Lady Stratham wished for a walking dress. Would Miss Morrow attend her at the Dower House on the 7th at 11 in the morning? The hand on that letter had been the same forward-pressed capitals, the same plain grey wax. The third note had come in the last week of that month. Lady Stratham was moving briefly to Ashford Park itself for the family gathering. Would Miss Morrow send along the final measurements and the fabric samples for the ball gown? And would she consider attending in person on the 12th for the fitting? The 12th was 2 days ago. The fitting had been on the 12th. The Dowager had spoken to her in the green sitting room afterward. The finished gown had been requested for the evening of the 14th, and the 14th was tonight. She had come to deliver, not to dine. That was what she had been telling herself, in fact, throughout the entire drive from town, as the coach jolted on the last mile and the rain refused to become snow. She would deliver the gown to Lady Stratham. She would collect the second half of her fee. She would drink a cup of tea in the housekeeper's room out of the way, and she would go home to her own workroom on Silver Street and to her own narrow bed and to the ledger she kept with a discipline that no one in her life had ever quite understood the point of. Her mother would ask later whether she had seen the Duke. She would say yes from across a room, briefly as one sees such men, and her mother would sigh in a manner that had been part of the wallpaper of Elspeth's life since she was 14 years old. Instead, she was standing in a corridor with her outer glove in her hand, and a footman was holding out a small square of card and repeating, with the patience of a man who has been trained not to repeat himself the second time, that she was expected at dinner. "There has been a mistake," she said. "His Grace, madam, does not tend toward mistakes." He was a very young man. He said it not smugly, but as one might repeat a piece of information one has been told to convey without altering its shape. She looked at the card. It was written in the same forward-pressed capitals, Miss E. Morrow, beneath the name in his own hand also, the words at the Duke's own table, and then, in a further small line, as if by afterthought, the fitted ivory. It suits her. She stood for a moment with the card in her fingers and considered the space between reasonable and possible. The reasonable was to go into the housekeeper's room and to drink the cup of tea and to wait for the carriage that had been ordered to take her back to Marlborough at 11. The possible was a number of things she could not, standing in a corridor with a candle in a sconce guttering to her left, quite bring herself to name. "I am not dressed for dinner," she said. "His Grace's sister, madam, supposes you will not mind if she offers you something. She is in the yellow room." There was, of course, a plan. There had been a plan for some time. She had not been given the whole shape of it yet. She was, at that moment, discovering it in the way a person discovers a change in the weather, first by a sensation on the skin, then by looking up. She went to the yellow room. Lady Stratham was standing at the window when Elspeth was shown in. She turned around at the sound of the door, and her face broke into a smile that was not the smile of a woman who intended anything cruel. "Miss Morrow, thank goodness. I told him he could not simply set your card down and expect the matter to have been settled by decree, but you must understand that my brother has been managed with too little success too long. There is an ivory in the wardrobe. I had it laid out. It is not perfect, but it will do, and you and I are of nearly the same height." Lady Stratham. I know. Please believe that I know. And I am aware that my mother has been to see you, and I am aware of the terms in which she made her feelings clear. She is not. I ought to tell you this once, and then I will not say it again. She is not a bad woman. She has held this house together for 41 years. She has held it on more than one occasion, with only her own 2 hands, and the sheer force of a jaw she inherited from her father. You will forgive her in time for being unequal to a moment which is not, in fact, hers. Elspeth said nothing. There was, in Lady Stratham's speech, an assumption she was not sure she was entitled to correct, or to accept, or to know the shape of. You are wondering what he means by it, said Lady Stratham. So is she. So am I. He has not told any of us. He has not been in the habit this year of telling any of us very much. She crossed to the wardrobe. The ivory. Come. The ivory was not perfect. It was cut for a woman 2 inches taller across the shoulder and half a stone heavier at the bust. But Elspeth Morrow had been dressing women for 7 years, and she pinned herself into it in 11 minutes and reshaped the fall of the sleeve with a needle borrowed from Lady Stratham's own workbox. And when she stood at last in front of the pier glass, she did not look exactly like a lady, but she did not look any longer like the woman who had come in from the coach. She looked like a woman it was possible to have overlooked and now, once looked at, to have some difficulty in looking away from. Lady Stratham studied her for a long moment with the expression of a person who was making a calculation whose sum she had already known. Yes, that is what he thought. Lady Stratham, Elspeth said, and she said it carefully, because she had learned across the previous 2 hours the precise degree to which the ground she was standing on had ceased to be the ground she had spent her life crossing. I would prefer, if you can bear it, to be told what it is that I am walking into. Lady Stratham did not answer at once. She smoothed a wrinkle at Elspeth's waist that had already been smoothed. Then she said, "You are walking into a dinner. It is not the sort of thing where anyone is going to say anything to you that you cannot answer. My mother will not speak to you directly because she cannot yet. Lady Selina Cranfield will speak to you because she does not yet know how not to. My brother will speak to you, and my brother will do it well. And by the time the meat is cleared, you will have the shape of the evening in your hand." She paused. "As for what he means, I do not know. But I have known my brother 32 years. He does not seat a woman at his right hand as a matter of decoration." The dining room at Ashford Park was long, low, and panelled in a wood so old it had gone the colour of dark honey. 32 chairs had been set. The candelabra had been lit, not with the bright wax of a modern London table, but with the softer, cheaper stuff that made the shadows behave in a manner more forgiving of complexion. There were 2 silver salt cellars at intervals. There was a bowl of white winter roses in the centre that Elspeth had noticed on her way in, were nearly the exact ivory of Lady Stratham's borrowed gown, and this was the sort of coincidence which, in a house not run by the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, might have been permitted to be a coincidence. She was seated. The Duke was already at his place. He had risen when she came in. The whole table had risen briefly, and he had done nothing after that to make the moment any more or less remarkable than it was already required to be by the arithmetic of the room. "Miss Morrow." "Your Grace." That was all he said at first. He waited for her to be seated. He waited for the small business of napkin and glass. He turned his head 1/4 and let the servant fill his own glass, and then, only when the Viscountess Carrel across from her had opened a conversation with the gentleman at her left about a horse, did he turn again and address Elspeth as though she were a person to whom he had been in the habit of addressing himself for many years. "You have been in this house before." "For fittings, Your Grace, twice." "And what did you find remarkable in it?" She thought about the question. She had been asked more difficult questions across her workroom counter. She had once been asked by a countess in mourning whether she believed in ghosts, and she had answered no with the kind of gentleness one uses when refusing a second helping. But she had not been asked at a dinner table by a duke, in a house she had entered 3 times, what she had found remarkable. The corridor between the yellow room and the dining room, Your Grace. The floorboards have been laid diagonally, which I have not seen elsewhere, and a servant this evening put out the 3rd sconce from the entrance without being told. She simply saw that it was smoking and put it out and moved on, and no one instructed her to do it, and no one thanked her for it, which is the sign in a house of a household run by someone who is very good at the work. The Duke had, across the previous sentence, not moved. He had, in fact, kept his glass at almost exactly the same distance from his mouth for its entire duration. That will be Mrs. Halstead. She has been housekeeper here since I was 11 years of age. You have been fortunate in Mrs. Halstead, Your Grace. So Mrs. Halstead has often instructed me. Down the table, at the very foot, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford was drinking her soup with the expression of someone who had heard the small exchange perfectly well across 24 feet of table, and was declining at present to acknowledge the fact that she had heard it. On Elspeth's other side, the Viscountess Carroll, a very tall woman of about 40, with an intelligent brown face, and a laugh that had, in the first course, twice cut across the general conversation of the table with the unself-conscious cheer of a woman who no longer required the approval of the Dowager Duchess of Ashford in order to enjoy herself, leaned slightly toward her. "You will do very well tonight, Miss Morrow," she said in a low voice, without looking directly at her, as one gives instruction across a battlefield. "Do not, whatever you do, apologize for being here. The Duke has never apologized for anything in his life, and it would embarrass him to see it done. I had not been planning to apologize, madam." "Good. Do not begin now." She would remember the dinner afterward in flashes rather than in sequence, and this in itself, she thought later, was the first sign that the evening had been of a weight her ordinary faculties had not been prepared to sort. The first course had been a clear soup she did not taste. The second had been a fish she tasted of a color between white and gold, in a sauce whose acid balanced its cream with the particular decisiveness of a French method. There had been a plate of small, savory pastries she did not eat, because she had learned as a girl, from her mother, that a woman who was uncertain of her table manners should stop 3 plates before the men did. There had been a joint of mutton whose carving had been done by the Duke himself, with a competence that suggested he had, at some period of his life, made the effort to learn. Between the fish and the mutton, Lady Selina Cranfield had spoken to her for the first time. Lady Selina had been placed on the Duke's left. She was 22 years old. She had a small, pointed face of the colour of a china cup, and hair the colour of unbleached linen, and eyes of a blue so pale that when the candlelight caught them from a particular angle, they appeared for a fraction of a second to have no colour in them at all. She had, throughout the fish, made no acknowledgment of Elspeth's presence except with the small, perfect turn of a shoulder that indicated she had noticed the presence and had elected not to remark upon it. Then she said, addressing not Elspeth, but the general area of the table between herself and the Viscountess Carroll, "How very curious it is that a woman should sew for her living. I have often wondered what one thinks about at such work, hour after hour." "One thinks, Lady Selina, of what one is sewing," Elspeth said. Lady Selina looked at her for the first time. She looked at her with the expression of a person who had, for 2 courses, been permitted the courtesy of not being addressed directly, and had not been prepared to have that courtesy withdrawn. "But surely, Miss Morrow, one cannot spend 6 hours a day thinking of hems." "With respect, Lady Selina, one can. It is what one is being paid to do. If a physician were to sit at this table, I should not ask him whether he had not tired this past decade of thinking about the human liver. It would be understood between us that he had been paid for it. The Duke, who had been in the act of turning to speak to the gentleman on his right, did not turn. He remained looking at his plate for the space of one full breath. Then he did what he had been about to do, and spoke to the gentleman on his right about the drainage of a field. Lady Selina did not address her again during the mutton, or during the pheasant, or during the puddings. The Viscountess Carrel, without turning her head, took a small sip of wine. "Very good," said the Viscountess Carrel into the silver rim of her glass. "Now do not, for the remainder of the evening, do anything else." At 10:30 the ladies withdrew. The Dowager rose and led them, and Elspeth rose with the rest, and the Dowager, in the passage from dining room to drawing room, said one thing to her. "Come with me, Miss Morrow." The Dowager was a small woman of 63, with the perfectly plain grey hair of someone who had elected in her 40s to stop dyeing it, and had never had cause to reconsider that decision. She wore black, because she had worn black since the death of the second Duke, and had not felt the change of fashion sufficient reason to alter the habit. She walked ahead of Elspeth without looking back, and led her into a small library that opened off the main passage, and she closed the door behind them with her own hand, and she turned, and she stood with her back to the fire. "I told you," said the Dowager without preamble, "that my son does not seat tradeswomen at his table. That was true when I said it. That was true for the entirety of the 4 decades and 1 year during which I have run this house. It is not true tonight. It ceased to be true in point of fact at approximately the moment my son took the card from the salver from which the arrangements were being finalized and struck out the name that was on it and wrote yours." The Dowager looked at her. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of a woman who had been given, in a language she did not speak, a message she was very much required to understand. "I do not know what my son intends by this. I have asked. He has declined to say. He is under no obligation to say. He is 32 years of age. He is the Duke. He owes me at this point of my life no explanations of the sort I might have demanded of him at 10. What I can tell you is this: he does not act quickly, and he does not act on caprice, and he does not, I have never known him to, act cruelly. If he means to make a fool of you, then he does not know he is doing it, which will not, in the end, make any difference to you. I do not think, Your Grace, that he means to make a fool of me." "No, neither do I." There was another pause. The fire cracked in a small, decisive way. "Miss Morrow, how long have you been in your workroom on Silver Street?" 7 years, Your Grace. "And your father?" Elspeth was for a moment at a loss. "My father, Your Grace. Your father, Thomas Morrow, the bookseller. He died 3 years ago last April, Your Grace." The Dowager nodded once, very slightly. She looked at the fire for a moment. She looked then back at Elspeth. "That is what I had thought. Go into the drawing room, Miss Morrow. Take tea. Do not, if you can help it, sit near Lady Selina Cranfield, whose mother is dear to me, but who is at present 22 years old, which is an age at which one is not always in command of oneself. I will send word for your carriage." That night she did not sleep on the drive back to Marlborough. She sat in the small, dark, hired coach with her outer glove on both hands at last, and the borrowed ivory folded into a paper package on the seat opposite her. Lady Streatham had insisted in a firm whisper at the door that she keep it, and Elspeth had not fought her on the matter, and she watched the tallow lamp at the front of the coach shudder against the black glass. And she made no attempt to arrange the evening into a sequence she could tell her mother in the morning. She could not tell her mother in the morning. That was the first thing she had decided, without deciding it, on the walk from the drawing room to the front hall. Her mother, if she heard, would try to hear the story as a story that had a shape she recognized. Her mother would say the words that were said in Marlborough by women of a certain standing when a young woman of another certain standing had been noticed by a gentleman of yet another. Her mother would not mean anything cruel by any of it. Her mother's meanings were, in fact, at all times, perfectly generous. It was only that her mother would try to name the thing, and Elspeth had learned across the previous 3 hours that this was a thing which, at present, no one at Ashford Park had troubled to name, and she was not going to be the one to name it first. There had been the moment in the library. That was the second thing she thought of. There had been the moment when the Dowager had asked about her father. That was not, she was almost certain, the question the Dowager had come into the library to ask. That was a question the Dowager had asked in place of another question. And Elspeth, who had learned across the 12 months following her father's death that grief was for the most part not a matter of loud crying, but of small tasks not done and small drawers not opened, had recognized the shape of a question asked instead of another, the way a person who has lost a limb recognizes another such person across a room. Her father had known Ashford Park. She was certain of that, without knowing how she was certain of it. Her father, who had not once in her memory mentioned the name of the Duke of Ashford, had known Ashford Park in some way that had returned to the house tonight in the shape of a card written in the Duke's own hand and set at the chair beside the Duke's own. She would find out, she thought. She had no immediate plan for finding out, but she had, for a few years now, been a woman who found out what she had decided to find out. November folded into December, and December was the sort of December that Wiltshire had, in which the ground froze at night and the rain came in the mornings, and by 2 of the afternoon the world was the colour of old iron. The workroom on Silver Street had, throughout the past week, been kept warm by a fire Elspeth Morrow lit at 6:30 in the morning and did not permit to die until she went upstairs to her narrow bed. She was in the middle of finishing a pelisse for the vicar's wife, a wedding gown for a Miss Frobisher of Bedwin, and 2 carriage dresses for Mrs. Otley of Ramsbury, and she was proceeding with all 3 at the pace of a woman who had elected, for reasons she was not disclosing to herself, to keep her hands very full. The notes had continued to arrive. She had not at first understood that they were notes of a particular kind. They came in the ordinary way, folded twice, sealed with the plain grey wax, and they concerned, in strict language, matters that were the strict concerns of a modiste. Lady Stratham required an additional pair of gloves. Lady Stratham had reconsidered the trim on the walking dress. Would Miss Morrow, at her earliest convenience, attend at Ashford Park on the 3rd of December for a small alteration? She would attend, of course. She had attended on the 3rd of December. She had gone that day in a hired trap, wrapped in the second-best cloak she owned, with her workbox on her knees and a small, careful expectation held closed at her chest, like a hand around a coin she was not yet ready to spend. Lady Stratham had been in the yellow room, so had the Duke. He had been standing at the window with his back to the door, and he had been reading a letter. He had turned when she came in, and he had not, on that occasion, said anything at all. He had bowed. He had gone out. Lady Stratham had, in the ensuing 40 minutes, spoken twice of her brother in a manner so ordinary that Elspeth was compelled to conclude the whole household had, since the 14th of November, elected to treat the seating of a dressmaker at the Duke's right hand as a matter of no consequence. She had left Ashford Park at 3 of the afternoon. On the drive back to Marlborough she had passed, on the Bath Road, a gentleman riding alone in the direction from which she had come. The gentleman had been the Duke of Ashford. He had raised his hat to her without slowing his horse. He had not, so far as she could see in the 2.5 during which she was permitted to see him, altered the expression of his face by any perceptible degree. That had been 3 weeks ago. The second note in his own hand, not through Lady Stratham, not with the grey wax, but sealed with a smaller impression of the Ashford arms and delivered by his own groom to her back door, had arrived on the 23rd of December. Miss Morrow, I am given to understand that your father, Mr. Thomas Morrow, was in trade in the town of Marlborough for many years, and that the premises he occupied on High Street are, since his death, occupied by a Mr. Kettering. Your father, in the course of my boyhood, was in the habit of setting aside for me, during my visits to Marlborough with my tutor, certain books which were later paid for at the ordinary price. I have 3 of them still. I mention this only in order that you may know it, since it was made known to me last spring, in ways not yet material, that my father had once made your father the same acknowledgment I now make to you. I do not require an answer. I regret the delay of nearly 19 years. Ashford. She had read the note twice. She had put it in the small brass box where she kept the notes of matter concerning her father, and she had gone downstairs and she had cut the police, and she had not, that day, permitted herself to think about the note again until she had extinguished the fire in the workroom at 11 of the evening. Then she had brought it upstairs. Then she had read it a 3rd time. Then she had gone to sleep and had not dreamed of him, and had woken at 6 and had begun again. The pattern of the winter, once she consented to see it as a pattern, was not difficult to describe. It was difficult only to submit to. Once a fortnight, at intervals which were slightly too regular to be accidental and slightly too irregular to be a scheme, a request would come from Lady Stratham for an alteration, a consultation, an opinion. Elspeth would attend at Ashford Park. Once every 3 of those visits, the Duke would be somewhere in the house at the time she was there. He would not in general seek her out. He would be reading or writing or occupied in some small quiet way, and he would greet her, and he would go on with what he had been doing, and she would go on with what she had been doing, and the 2 of them, in a house of 38 rooms and 131 acres of parkland, would arrange, without seeming to arrange it, to be in the same room together for approximately 11 minutes on each occasion. Once every 2nd month, on average, he rode into Marlborough. On the occasions on which he rode into Marlborough, he passed the workroom door once. He did not, on any of these occasions, come in. He rode past on his way toward High Street, where a gentleman by the name of Kettering now sold books at a slower rate than the previous proprietor had sold them, and where the Duke, Elspeth had been informed by the widow who kept the linen drapers next door to her own workroom, was known to spend 20 minutes each visit, and to leave with 2 volumes. She did not know, and did not permit herself to inquire, what the 2 volumes were. Once on the 6th of January, in a wind that was blowing straight down Silver Street from the direction of the Downs, he did come in. He removed his hat. He asked for 6 yards of the same dove-coloured wool of which she had, at their first meeting, worn a plain dress cut clean at the throat. He did not, in explaining the request, offer a purpose for it. He paid for it. He carried the parcel out under his own arm. He said at the door, "Good afternoon, Miss Morrow," and did not, from that afternoon until the 16th of February, appear in the town at all. That the town was watching, she was in no doubt. She had not, throughout her working life, been the object of watching of this kind. She had been the object of watching of another kind. Women who came into her workroom to see whether she was as competent as had been reported. Mothers who came in to determine whether their daughters might safely be permitted to sit an hour in her company. Wives of gentlemen who came in to inquire what the price of a good silk had risen to that season. But this was a watching she had not, in her 7 years, been required to answer to. She answered to it by continuing to work. She answered to it by continuing to walk to church on Sundays with her mother, and by continuing to receive her customers in the order in which they had appointed to be received, and by continuing to say nothing to anyone about what she had learned over the course of the winter, of the way in which certain gentlemen paid their attentions to certain women. Her mother twice made small oblique inquiries. Elspeth's mother was a woman of Marlborough. Elspeth's mother would not, in 100 years, have used the word courting to her daughter across the breakfast table. She used, instead, the mild dialect of a person who has raised a child alone since that child was 15 and has learned to ask a great deal by asking almost nothing. "They say the Duke was in town on Wednesday," her mother said, in early February, over a plate of bread and butter. "He was. They say he called at Kettering's. So he does when he comes. Did he call anywhere else?" "No, Mother." Her mother had at that nodded once, and had cut a further slice of bread and butter, and had said nothing more. What her mother did not say, what her mother sat on that morning with the tact of a woman who had been sitting on such things for the whole of her married life, was the plain observation that 6 yards of dove-coloured wool, purchased in the 6th of January by a duke, could only, in the space of the ensuing 5 weeks, have been for one thing, which was that he had wished to have in his hand a length of the colour of the dress that was worn by a person he was, for reasons no one had been permitted to name, refusing to stop thinking about. The letter that undid it, that was the phrase Elspeth used afterward, when the winter had turned into spring, and the spring had done what she had not, at the time, thought the spring would do. The letter that undid it arrived on the 3rd of March, and it did not arrive at her. It arrived at her mother, Elspeth's mother, whose name was Anne Morrow, and who was 54 years of age, and who had, since the death of Elspeth's father, kept a small parlour room at the back of Elspeth's workroom, in which she took in, without any particular need of the money, the plainer sewing that Elspeth herself no longer had the hours for, opened the letter at 11 of the morning at the small deal table by the window. She read it once. She read it a second time. She folded it. She put it under a saucer. She went out without her bonnet into Silver Street, and she walked to the corner of High Street, where she stood for a moment in the road, and she came back and she put on her bonnet and she went upstairs and she knocked on the door of the room in which Elspeth was fitting a Miss Frobisher's mother into a morning dress, and she said in the voice she reserved for matters no one else in the world was to be permitted to overhear, "Elspeth, I am sorry. Come out, my love." The letter had been anonymous. It had been written in a hand so plain and so square that it must, Elspeth thought when she saw it, have been copied out slowly and deliberately by someone who did not habitually write in that manner. It had been addressed to Mrs. Morrow, milliner, Marlborough, though Anne Morrow had never in her life been a milliner, and had said, in 11 lines, "Madam, it is thought by many in the town, and by many at Ashford Park, that your daughter has been throughout the winter receiving from the Duke of Ashford attentions of a nature which will not, in the end, be to her advantage. It is thought by some that she has already been placed in his keeping, and by others that she is on the point of being so placed. The Duke, as is known, is to be married in the summer to Lady Selina Cranfield. It is the opinion of a friend of your family that your daughter would do well to close her workroom and to remove to a distance before the marriage is announced. She will not be received in Marlborough again once it is. A well-wisher." Elspeth read the letter 3 times. She did not sit down, because the small 3-legged stool by the deal table was not a stool she could sit down on with dignity. She read it a 4th time. She put it flat on the table. She looked at her mother. "Have I been receiving attentions from the Duke of Ashford, mother?" "Elspeth, have I? Answer me, I'm asking you. You have known me all my life, and you have watched this winter as closely as anyone in the town has watched it, and I am asking you, have I?" Anne Morrow looked at her daughter. Anne Morrow had, throughout her life, been a woman not much given to what her husband, when he had been alive, had called the higher sentiments. She had been the woman who had, when Thomas Morrow had come home from a booksellers' meeting in Bath, and had wept from disappointment, sat down beside him and eaten a second dinner with him because that was the thing to do. She was not, at present, weeping. Her voice was even. "You have been receiving attentions, Elspeth. You have been receiving them in a manner so quiet that the person paying them may not himself have known he was paying them. But you have been receiving them, and the whole town has known it, and I have known it, And I have said nothing to you because I did not think that any of it was going to come to any end that would please you. And I did not want to be the woman who forced you to see a thing before you had chosen to see it. And is he going to marry Lady Selina Cranfield? I do not know, my love. I have no way of knowing. But it is being said. It is being said. She closed the workroom that afternoon. She did not close it in the manner of a person announcing the closure. She did not put a card in the window, but she sent word to the 3 ladies whose fittings had been appointed for the following morning that a matter had arisen and their appointments would be resumed on a date to be advised. She sent her second girl, whose name was Hannah Poole, and who was 17 and had begun to cry the moment she heard the tone of Elspeth's voice, home to her mother in the village of Bedwin with 2 weeks' wages in advance. She banked the fire. She put the police on its stand under a cover. She took her ledger upstairs and her small brass box of notes, and she sat down at the desk in her bedroom, and she began to write to the Duke of Ashford. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was a page long and would have made a good story afterward and was not the letter she was going to send. The second was 6 lines long and was closer, and she tore it up too. The third was 2 lines and was the one she sent. It read, "Your Grace, I have received an anonymous communication in which it is asserted that you are to be married to Lady Selina Cranfield in the summer, and in which certain further assertions are made concerning me which I will not repeat. I would take it as a great kindness if you would advise me of the truth of the first assertion, in order that I may govern my own conduct accordingly. E. Morrow." She sent it by the boy from the Angel Inn, who could be relied on to deliver a letter to Ashford Park by dusk, and who would, for an additional 6pence, wait for a reply. The boy came back at 10 of the evening. There was no reply. She lay in bed at 11 and stared at the ceiling. She lay in bed at midnight and stared at the ceiling. She rose at 4, dressed, went down into the workroom, lit the fire, and began, with the small ivory scissors her father had given her when she was 19, to unpick the lining of a spencer whose lining did not, in fact, require to be unpicked. At 6 of the morning, on the 4th of March, in the pale grey light of Silver Street, a carriage pulled up at her door. It was not the Duke. It was the Dowager Duchess of Ashford. The Dowager was wearing a travelling cloak over the black wool she wore every day, and her small, severe bonnet and gloves that had been mended. Elspeth saw at once with the automatic eye of her profession, once at the wrist and once at the palm. The Dowager, in other words, was a woman who kept her gloves in service beyond the point at which most women of her position would have had them replaced, and had not troubled herself, on the drive from Ashford Park at 5 of the morning, to change them for a fresh pair. "Miss Morrow, may I come in?" "Your Grace." The Dowager came in. She took the small hard chair by the window. She removed her gloves. She placed them on the deal table with a precision that did not permit them to sit at any angle other than parallel to the grain. "I have not much time. My son is in Bath. He rode out yesterday at 4. He will be back by 3 of this afternoon. He does not know I am here. He does not know that you have written to him, because he did not receive your letter. It arrived at Ashford Park at 11 of last night, after he had gone. It is at present unopened, on the salver in the entrance hall. I have not read it. I do not intend to read it. Whatever it says, he will read it as soon as he returns, and he will answer it in the manner he answers such things. And I am not. I have never been in the habit of interfering in the correspondence of my son." The Dowager paused. She looked at Elspeth as she had looked at her in the library at Ashford Park. There was, in her eyes, a tiredness Elspeth had not seen at that first meeting, which had not been there under the same light of the fire, and which had not, she suspected, arrived in the past 12 hours. "I have come to tell you 2 things, Miss Morrow. The first is that my son is not going to marry Lady Selina Cranfield. The second is that I know who wrote the letter you received yesterday morning, or if I do not know precisely, I know within a very narrow field. It is a person of my acquaintance, and it is a person who wrote it in her own mind in your interest. And it is a person to whom I will speak this evening when I return, and who will not, I give you my word, trouble you again." Elspeth said nothing for a long moment. "Your Grace, may I ask?" "You may ask what you like. I may not answer." "Did you write the letter?" The dowager, who had not, in Elspeth's experience of her, done anything with her face except make it slightly more of what it had been at rest, did now permit her face to alter. She closed her eyes for 1 second. She opened them. "No, Miss Morrow, I did not write the letter. I would not have written the letter. I would have sat you down if I had thought the matter required it, and I would have told you what I thought to your face. I have not, in the past 4 months, thought that the matter required it, and I do not think it now. I came here this morning because a friend of mine sat down last night after supper and had 2 glasses of a claret which does not agree with her, and told me with an air of great satisfaction what she had done that morning, and I recognized in her satisfaction the satisfaction of a woman who has done a very foolish thing and told herself it was a kind one." She stopped. She looked for the first time less at Elspeth than at the window behind her, and the grey light of 6 in the morning coming through it. "He is not going to marry Lady Selina, Miss Morrow. I ask you to keep that to yourself for the space of 1 day, until my son has had the opportunity to say it publicly himself, which I believe he will do this week. And I ask you not to close your workroom, and I ask you not to leave Marlborough. I ask this not on my son's behalf, since he can ask it for himself. I ask it on my own. Do you understand me?" "I understand you, Your Grace." "Very well," said the dowager. She put her gloves back on. She stood up. She was a small woman, and she was, in the small light of the room, older than she had permitted herself to appear at the dinner table 3 months before, and Elspeth, at that particular moment, understood something about the woman she had not previously understood. "Your Grace, Miss Morrow, I am sorry." The dowager paused with her hand on the latch. "For what, Miss Morrow?" "For a great many small things over the past 3 months, which I have permitted to happen without asking anyone what they were, because I did not wish to be told that I was mistaken about them." The dowager looked at her, and the tiredness moved in her eyes, and did not go away, but altered. "That, Miss Morrow, is the ordinary condition of a woman of any intelligence in this country. I would not distress yourself on account of it. Good morning." She went out. The carriage rolled off toward the Bath Road. Elspeth Morrow sat down at the deal table and put her hands flat on it, and did not, for the space of perhaps 4 minutes, move. Then she got up. She raked out the fire. She rebuilt it. She unlatched the workroom shutters. She rehung the police. And at 9 of the morning, when the widow who kept the linen drapers next door came out to sweep her front step, Elspeth was already sitting at her long table with a length of pale primrose in front of her, working the seam of a hem so evenly that a person who did not know her would have believed her to be a woman with whom nothing whatever was, at that moment, occurring. He came at 4 of the afternoon. He rode alone, and he tied the horse himself at the ring outside the linen drapers, and he took off his hat at the door of the workroom, and he came in without ringing the small bell that was set above the latch to warn her of a customer, because he had put his hand on the bell, held it silent as he passed under it, and released it only when he had closed the door behind him. He was, Elspeth saw, tired. He was tired in the way of a man who had ridden the Bath Road from Bath in 1 day, in the middle of March in Wiltshire, without changing his coat. And he was tired also in the way of a man who had, on his return, read a letter of 2 lines and had chosen not to sit down to write an answer to it. She had been at the long table. She had risen when the door opened. She had, without consulting herself on the point, put down the small ivory scissors on the wool that lay in front of her before she turned. "Miss Morrow, Your Grace." He did not at once cross to her. He stood at the door. He looked once around the room, at the fire, at the pier glass, at the long table with its half-cut primrose, at the pelisse under its cover on the stand, at the small brass box on the shelf above the counter, and then he looked at her. "I have received your letter." "Yes, Your Grace. I have not answered it in writing." "So I see. I am not going to marry Lady Selina Cranfield. I was never going to marry Lady Selina Cranfield. There was a period, in the autumn, of some 10 days, during which my mother believed I might be persuaded to marry Lady Selina Cranfield. I was not persuaded. My mother has been informed. My mother has, in fact, come to inform you, which was not her office, and which I would have preferred she not undertake in my absence, and for which I owe you my regret and, if you can bear it, an apology." "Your mother, Your Grace, did nothing that requires an apology. That is a very charitable statement, and I do not entirely believe you have made it in earnest." "I have made it, Your Grace, with all the earnestness of a woman who spent 2 hours this morning discovering that her mother-in-law of a certain kind, whom she had believed to be her enemy, was in fact prepared to drive out on the Bath Road at 5 in the morning in order to correct a wrong she had not herself committed. He absorbed that. He did not at once cross to her. He came at last 3 steps closer, so that he was on the customer's side of the long table, and she was on the modiste's side of it, and there was between them the pale primrose of the half-cut wool, and the wooden rule with its brass tip, and the small ivory scissors her father had given her at 19. The other assertions in the anonymous letter, I would not have you believe I know what they were. I would like you to tell me." She told him. She used the words that had been used. He listened. He listened with the expression of a man who had already, in the course of the ride, imagined the general shape of what would have been asserted, and who was measuring the exact assertion against his imagination, and who was making, silently, in his own mind, some small adjustment concerning a person Elspeth was fairly certain was the person the Dowager had gone to speak to that evening. When she had finished, he did not immediately say anything. "I have, in my keeping," he said at last, 3 books that belong to your father. One is a Cowper, one is a Virgil, one is a Herodotus in a green morocco binding that he rebound himself, and that has on the flyleaf an inscription in his own hand, I mean your father's, to the effect that it had been intended for a person he called only young A, whom he had not seen in some years, and to whom he wished to convey his continued good opinion. I did not know, when the books were returned to me, that they had come from your father's shop, because they were returned to me not by a bookseller, but by an executor. I discovered it in the spring of last year. I did not act on the discovery for some months, because I did not think you would want to hear from me, and because I did not know what I would say if I did. Then Lady Stratham's account fell due, and it was rendered in a hand I recognized, and I paid it, and I wrote you a note in which I said too little. And Lady Stratham observed that you were quiet and competent, and disliked green worn in the presence of Lord Stratham, and I asked her to invite you again. And on the 14th of November, when the arrangements for the dinner were being made, I took the salver from Mrs. Halstead and struck out a name that did not please me and wrote yours, which was not a courteous thing to do to a household that had been managed with great care for 41 years, and which I did in any case. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the primrose on the table. I am not, as it happens, in the habit of being told by other people who they think I mean to marry. It was possible, at any given point over the past 4 months, to have been more direct with you than I was. I chose the slower path because I did not wish to make you the subject of a decision of mine before you had had the winter to decide, on your own account, whether the decision would have been welcome. It was, on my part, a piece of calculation. It was made in your interest, and it has failed you, and I am sorry. I would like to ask you a question. You are not required to answer it today. You are not required to answer it this week. You are, in fact, permitted to answer it in whatever season and by whatever means makes it possible for you to answer it truly. May I ask it?" She looked at him across the table. "You may." He asked it. He asked it in a voice so quiet that afterward, when she tried to remember exactly what he had said, she remembered less the words than the movement of his mouth around them, which was the movement of a man saying, for the first time in his life, a sentence he had rehearsed a great many nights in a great many rooms and had not yet, until that afternoon, permitted himself to say aloud. He asked her whether at some point which was hers to determine, and in some form which was hers to name, she would consider allowing him to place her name at the head of a table, which was, from any reasonable distance, plainly hers. She did not answer him at once. She looked down at the primrose. She thought about her father and the cowper and the small brass box on the shelf above the counter, and Hannah Poole in Bedouin, and the police under its cover, and the dowager's mended gloves on the deal table, and the way in which a workroom on Silver Street would still, in 10 years, be a workroom on Silver Street, and the way in which a duchess of a certain kind might still, in 10 years, keep her ledgers in her own hand. Then she said one thing to him. She said it as quietly as he had asked. "Your Grace, I have not, so far this winter, permitted myself to think about the question you have just asked. I'm going to think about it now. I'm going to think about it for some weeks. I would ask you, in the meantime, to continue to ride into Marlborough at intervals which are, as they have been, slightly too regular to be accidental and slightly too irregular to be a scheme, and to continue to buy your 2 volumes at Kettering's, and to continue, when you have occasion, to come in for 6 yards of the dove-coloured wool. When I am ready to answer you, I will tell you, not before." He looked at her. He did the thing, in the small movement of his mouth, that he did with his face when he was choosing not to speak. He inclined his head, the very slight inclination of a gentleman who had received an answer that was, to a person who understood the language in which it had been given, entirely the answer he had come for. "Miss Morrow." "Your Grace." He went out. He put on his hat at the door. He untied the horse. He rode out of Silver Street at a walk, and at the corner of High Street, where the horse turned toward the Bath Road, he did not look back. The spring came in the way spring came in Wiltshire that year, reluctantly. The frost went out of the ground in the 2nd week of April. The elms at Ashford Park showed green at the tips on the 20th. On a morning in late April, in the small parlour behind the workroom, Anne Morrow set the teapot down between herself and her daughter and said without preamble, "There is a thing I ought to have told you the day your father was buried, and did not, because I did not think you would need to know it, and I was mistaken." She told it. She told it plainly. She told her in the space of 11 minutes of the summer of 1809, when Thomas Morrow had gone up to Ashford Park himself with a parcel of 3 books for a young man he had known since that young man was 10 years old, and had drunk a glass of Madeira with him in the library there, and had come home and put the parcel receipt in the small brass box that was now on the shelf above the counter, and had never spoken of the visit again. Because Thomas Morrow was a man who did not speak of such things. Elspeth found the receipt that evening. It was in a hand she knew as well as she knew her own. It was signed at the bottom with an initial in the same forward-pressed capital she now had reason to know. Lady Stratham's ball gown, which had been finished in November and worn once and not yet paid for the second half of, was paid for the second half of by a bank draft on Coots of the Strand on the 3rd of May, which was the day on which, in the church at Marlborough, the banns of the Duke of Ashford and Miss Elspeth Morrow were read for the first time. Her mother wept quietly at the back pew. The dowager sat in the front pew, on the aisle, in the plain black wool she wore every day, and she did not weep, and she did not, at any point during the reading, alter the expression of her face. But at the door of the church, When it was over, she took Elspeth by the hand still gloved, the glove of a colour the linen drapers called dove, and she said, so that only Elspeth could hear, "Welcome, my dear." The card that had been written in the Duke's own hand on the 14th of November was, by then, at the back of the small brass box on the shelf above the counter. Elspeth did not, that summer, close the workroom on Silver Street. She trained a third girl, and she trained a fourth. She kept the ledger in her own hand. She continued on Wednesdays to receive customers. And on the evening of her wedding, at the long, low table in the dining room at Ashford Park, when the candles were lit with the softer wax that made the shadows behave, and the 32 chairs were set, and the bowl of white summer roses was in the centre, Mrs. Halstead came in with the salver of cards. The card at the chair immediately to the right of the Duke of Ashford had that evening no name on it at all. She sat down beside him. He looked at her. He did not at once speak. Then he took her hand under the table, briefly, and let it go, and turned to speak to the gentleman on his right about the drainage of a field. She poured her own wine. The rain, outside, had not that evening come. Stories told with quiet love. There was a card that no one had thought to warn her about. There was a table that had been set for years without her. There was a house that had been waiting to know its mistress by the plain edge of her sleeve. Between the winter and the spring, the long road had straightened without ever being asked. He was the man that the town had misjudged. She was the woman who had learned to keep her own accounts. It was, in the end, a matter of a chair, and of a name, and of a hand held under the table for the count of one breath, and no longer. There was a card. There was a table. There was a hand. There was a woman who did not close her door. There was a card. There was a table. There was a hand. There was a man who did not, after all, ride past. There was a card that no one had thought to warn her about. There was a table that had been set for years without her. There was a house that had been waiting to know its mistress by the plain edge of her sleeve. Between the winter and the spring, the long road had straightened without ever being asked. He was the man that the town had misjudged. She was the woman who had learned to keep her own accounts. It was, in the end, a matter of a chair, and of a name, and of a hand held under the table for the count of one breath and no longer. There was a card. There was a table. There was a hand. There was a woman who did not close her door. There was a card. There was a table. There was a hand. There was a man who did not, after all, ride past. If stories like this keep you company in the quiet hours, leave a comment and a subscribe here. It is what keeps them being told. This is a work of fiction set in Regency, England. Any resemblance to persons or events real is only coincidence.